there's this fatal flaw, I think, with the minimal facts for sure. It really doesn't matter about quick and efficient. That said, I do think that argument that I would make for the resurrection does have an elevator pitch version that I feel like I could give within a couple of minutes.
What if I told you every single time that I ever talk to a skeptic, I can get them to say the disciples, they actually believe they had an experience?
I think you could get skeptics to acknowledge that people really thought they saw Joseph Smith's golden plates. So what?
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm talking about the best evidence for Christianity, as well as if we should be using the minimal facts. Today I have Erik Manning from Testify on here to talk about. This is Christmas edition. We're going to talk about also the maximal facts and just have that discussion because we've got a lot going on here. So, Erik, how are you doing today? Can you give us just your background on the topic and YouTube and all that?
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Erik Manning, and I run the YouTube channel Testify, which will be hitting probably its like 2-year anniversary of me like regularly publishing videos every week at the end of December. So that's pretty cool. And so I mostly focus on historical apologetics, the argument for miracles, the reliability of the Gospels, the resurrection, and those are kind of the topics that I'm interested in. Before the YouTube channel, I was writing a blog, isjesusalive.com, for several years, and it's just kind of morphed into the channel. I'm just kind of a lay person. I don't have any sort of like formal education necessarily in apologetics, but I've been studying the topic for about 10 years and have just been mentored kind of by some of the McGrews and, Tim and Lydia. And to a certain extent, they've been able to kind of work with me, and they're the ones who really got me interested in historical apologetics and kind of pointed me down the road with lots of books and materials and, help and answering questions when I need it. So yeah, that's just kind of who I am and what I'm about as far as apologetics goes.
Awesome. Yeah. And everyone should definitely check out Testify, Erik here. He's got an awesome channel, talk about Jesus' resurrection, just typical, reliability of the Gospels and, typical scholar arguments that, are sometimes good, sometimes bad. And he talks about it to, help find truth better. So definitely recommend him. All right. So I've got some goals here for our interview. This is a little bit different because, for the most part, I've been a fan of the minimal facts argument, and Erik here has not. And, he's been on a rampage getting everyone to agree with him here. So this will be definitely a fun discussion here. So as far as goals, what I want to do is I want to be able to correctly summarize the minimal facts argument so people can know Erik knows what he's talking about and yet still disagrees with it. I want Erik here to be able to present a better way for Christians to believe in Christianity, as well as just give evidence in general. And so those are the three goals here. And so, Erik, can you summarize what the minimal facts argument is?
Sure. Well, I mean, I used to use the minimal facts as well, so I've not always been like a hater. I guess I have this kind of reputation, but I'm just trying to help people use better arguments. It's not anything personal. I really actually like the hearts of people like Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, and I really believe that they have a passion for evangelism and truth and helping people being strengthened in their faith. But no, the minimal facts basically is it's facts that are agreed upon by a consensus of scholars, including skeptics across the ideological spectrum, who agree with that fact. And so in order to meet the minimal facts criteria, I believe Habermas puts it at about 90% or better. And so that scholars will acknowledge a certain fact. Now, some of the facts, the big ones when people are using to argue for the resurrection is that Jesus died through, the process of crucifixion. Then very soon afterwards, Jesus's disciples had experiences that they at least believed were appearances of the resurrected Jesus. And then a lot of times you'll add Paul, just a couple of years later, a few years later, Saul of Tarsus experienced what he thought was a post-resurrection appearance of the risen Jesus. And the argument goes that the natural explanations for these facts don't particularly work, that the best explanation that we can infer is that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. Now they'll bring in other additional facts that they'll argue for that aren't necessarily minimal facts, maybe like the empty tomb. Gary Habermas likes to bring that in, but he will acknowledge that there's a less of a degree of consensus regarding the empty tomb, that it's more like 60 to 75%, I think. And so that's basically it in summary, is that all the other natural explanations don't really work. The best explanation is that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
They have to subscribe and click a bell now?
Gotcha. Okay. So what would you consider are the biggest flaws with the argument?
Well, the biggest flaw, I think, is the limitations of this particular appearance fact. Just because scholars acknowledge that they believe that they had appearances doesn't mean like they were actually described like they were in details in the details in the Gospel of accounts. Not enough scholars across the ideological spectrum acknowledge that. In fact, most liberal scholars will absolutely strongly question that. They'll push back on that. And so it's very more limited. And I feel like we're kind of getting excited about something that I guess I would say isn't really that exciting. There is basically, if we can't really adduce what the appearances were like, and this is the main contention, then it's hard to say that the disciples were actually rational for believing that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And so I think that's kind of the biggest problem. If we don't know what the appearances were like, then how do we know? And so there are scenarios that I think are even consistent with the appearance fact that I don't think we would say were very strong, like a floating non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus who only appears once briefly and speaks a few words and disappears. A lot of where they're getting the minimal facts, where the scholars tend to agree, is they agree on a creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which talks about the appearances to the 12, to Paul, to Peter, to James, and to 500. And they mostly agree that at least part of that particular passage is an early Christian creed. But nothing in 1 Corinthians 15, and it shouldn't be pressed this hard anyways, because it is, after all, just a creed, gives us any details about what those appearances were like. It doesn't tell us if they were seeing exactly the same thing or something like that. And so that's the biggest problem, is anytime you're dealing with a miracle claim, you don't want a vague claim. And I think this is what Dal Allison has really pointed out a lot in his books about apologetics and the resurrection and different things like that, is that he's constantly harping on the fact that the details are just not enough, because Dale basically assumes, and I'm sure he'd be prepared to argue for it, that the gospel accounts aren't reliable. And the minimal facts apologist is going to say, I can grant for you that the gospels are a mess. And they still say that they can prove the resurrection. But the gospels are what give us the details of what the resurrection appearances were like, details of which would be very difficult to be mistaken about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. That makes perfect sense. Is that all you had?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, I'm sure as we go along, we could get into kind of more details about
Okay.
that. But that's the main issue. If we don't know what the details are like, it's really hard to say that they're rational. If somebody's giving you a miracle claim and you don't know the details of that particular claim, who is there, what exactly did they see, what exactly was experienced,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that you would be justifiably skeptical of that particular claim.
Gotcha. Yeah, perfect sense. Okay. So, a big reason why the minimal effects is used is because, it's quick, it's, easy to memorize, rhetorically powerful, or, that's what people that use it think at least. Easy to understand, evidentially efficient. Can you give the audience what you would consider a proper replacement that is also quick, rhetorically efficient, powerful, easy to understand, and evidentially strong, all that kind of stuff?
Well, I think if we're going to have to go further than the minimal facts to make a robust case, then it really doesn't matter about quick and efficient. Um, I'm not saying that quick and efficient isn't good, but quick and efficient isn't a very good test of truth. If the criticisms that I've raised and Dr. Lydia McGrew has raised, which she has like a whole playlist on her channel that I would definitely recommend checking out. She has several blog posts on her blog where she has criticized the minimal facts and goes into more details that I've gone into here. And I've got a playlist of videos on my channel as well. If our arguments are correct, then we really don't have a choice. And so I don't think, I think we have like this debate culture mentality, or we have maybe low expectations on people that we feel like we have to dumb everything down, that we feel like, well, I have to have minimal facts because it's fast and it's easy and it's quick and it's efficient. Now, that said, I do think that the argument that I would make for the resurrection does have an elevator pitch version that I feel like I could give within a couple of minutes. But like ultimately, we're after truth, not efficiency. We're not salesmen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it makes sense.
Yep.
So, I mean, you mentioned, dumbing everything down. So, I mean, I don't know how much you watched of my interview with Blake Giunta, but,
Watched it.
yeah, he specifically, actually, it's funny you say that. He, specifically talked about, while we are concerned about truth here, when we're talking to people, if we're trying to, tell people about the truth, we have to be able to do it in a way that people are able to receive it well, that they will be, that we can get biases out of the way so that they can understand truth better. We're not trying to manipulate them, but at the same way, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for them to understand so they can see what's true. Now, obviously you can disagree that it's true or not. That's a different question, or, evidential and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it seems like you're saying that, that doesn't matter. Maybe you can clarify, like, when you're evangelizing, is that not a concern for you?
When I'm evangelizing, I'm going to preach the gospel. If I need to bring evidence within the discussion, I absolutely am prepared to and happy to. Primarily when I'm evangelizing and talking to the lost, I'm not necessarily just immediately going into a bunch of facts and evidence. I'm
Sure.
going to talk to them about their because I don't know what background knowledge they have. That's probably going to come out through the natural course of the conversation. And so I'm going to share with them the gospel and that they're a sinner, and that they've broken God's laws and that we deserve punishment for breaking those laws, but Christ took our punishment in our stead. And so that if we believe in him, we could have eternal life. If we can believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead and confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord, that we'll be saved. And so when I'm going out and doing evangelism, I don't always find that I have to necessarily argue for the historicity of the resurrection. The most pushback I get is like, well, I think hell is really unfair and unjust. Or why does God allow so much evil and different things like that? And so I'm not saying that I'm not prepared to do that, but I'm not giving a presentation of the resurrection historicity at that particular point. Now, as far as like if I just had like a few minutes to talk to somebody about why they should believe in the resurrection for historical reasons, well, I would mention the fact that Jesus is crucified, but that his followers also said that he literally physically rose again from the dead. That's a pretty unusual claim. And so when it comes to any kind of claim, there are always three different options. Either his followers were liars, that his followers were mistaken, or that Jesus rose from the dead. And you might recognize this similar to C.S. Lewis's trilemma, only I'm applying it to the disciples. Now, when we're evaluating a claim like this, there's nothing wrong with like considering like, well, maybe they're lying. Maybe this is fraud or something like that. Well, I would just say that the context of their claim makes it very improbable that they were lying. The disciples were willing to undergo labors, dangers, and sufferings, and sometimes even martyrdom, but we're preaching the resurrection anyways. And the claims that they were making were public to a hostile audience in an attempt to found a new religious group. They weren't going to be really well received. And so, like I said, I think it makes it very unlikely that they were lying. Now, were they mistaken? Well, that's a very popular interpretation of what happened. And lots of people don't want to say they just lied will think of some kind of religious hysteria or overinterpretation. Well, the content of the disciples' claims makes it very improbable that they were mistaken. And so, I mean, if you look at the accounts in the Gospels, they said that the different groups of them had lengthy conversations with Jesus. They were able to touch Jesus. Jesus invited them to touch him. They ate with them on multiple occasions. And so these are things that are extremely difficult for them to be mistaken about. And so now what I'm going to say is that the Gospels relate, there's an avalanche of evidence that the Gospels are written by people who were honest, who were scrupulous, who were close up to the facts. And so what they're reporting goes back to what the eyewitnesses claimed. And so that's basically kind of like the short version. I could probably even give a much shorter version than that, but I don't think that's particularly that long or difficult to go through. Now they might say, well, what kind of evidence do we have for the trustworthiness of these gospel authors? Well, at that time, I'm more than happy to run through several different examples, whether internal or external, that show that these authors were reliable, trustworthy people. And so what best explains these claims? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean totally. And I'd love to get into why you would justify the Gospels being reliable and all that. I mean, you said, we're just going to preach the gospel, and of course I mean, you didn't say just preach the gospel, but you're saying it seemed like you said that's your I guess your go-to in an evangelizing discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna preach the gospel. I'm gonna assume that they have a conscience. I'm going to assume that
Mm.
their conscience is condemning them. I think if I bring the law into the situation, I'm not going to go totally Ray Comfort on them necessarily and be like, "Have you ever looked at a woman with lust?" So if you ever stolen something, you ever told a
That
lie?
was great. That's nice.
That's my really bad Ray Comfort impersonation. But no, I think mostly there's a lot right about his presentation, and I probably would say something along that lines. I'd probably include myself in there and be like, I know I have. But if there's pushback, then yeah, let's. How do I know this isn't just a fairy tale? How do I know that there's good evidence for miracles? Well, if I'm asking them to commit their life and completely turn their life around, I better do better than, well, the disciples really sincerely believe that they had experiences. I think as if somebody's really skeptical, if somebody's like wants to be sure that they're committing their life to something that's true, they're going to have some questions. What were those appearances like? Was it just like a vision? Like, how did the appearances go down? Like, what went on during those appearances? Vague miracle reports just aren't enough to make somebody completely change their lives. There are lots of vague, very undetailed miracle reports out there in other religions. So why should they pick the Christian one? And so that's why I think the details of their testimony of what the apostles, the disciples, and Paul actually experienced, where Paul's experience was obviously visionary and different, but this is something that also the minimal facts advocate doesn't have at their disposal. Paul doesn't even talk about what his experience was like in any detail. We have to go to the book of Acts in order to find out that he was blinded, that that he had other witnesses that at least heard a voice, even though they didn't understand it, that he was healed by Ananias. Well, I'm totally prepared to argue that the author of Acts is extremely reliable and a traveling companion of Paul and would be in a position to know. Somebody who's an advocate of minimal facts, they're going to have to leave the minimal facts completely in order to make that stronger case. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of regards, someone that takes minimal facts, they might think that it is stronger than you portray. I don't really have much interest in debating that specific part of the minimal facts here today. But I mean, at the same time, though, you mean that Habermas and I would assume that if I understand them correctly, I know for sure that like Giunta, he talked about how there's if he has to go further, he's more than happy to. But
Sure.
so what exactly am I missing? Because it seems like both of you guys are more than happy to give all the evidence. Even on
Yeah.
his website, he
I,
talked about all the evidence.
evidence for like Blake has a tremendously beneficial website, Belief Map. Highly recommend. Um, and so I know he's prepared to go into that evidence, but at that point he's leaving the minimal facts. Okay, so minimal facts. The problem is that Habermas, and you can see it in his book, his co-authored book with Dr. Lacona, and he's made several public statements and different things like that. That the minimal facts bills itself as the argument like for the resurrection in terms of just with the minimal facts alone I can rule out all other naturalistic explanations. Okay, I don't think it can do that, and so he's going to have to bring him in additional evidence. And if you ever listen to like there's an article that I think Jordan Peterson tweeted out like a long time ago, I think this is like 4 years ago, where Dr. Habermas refers to the minimal facts in an article in the Stream. But in the middle of that, he talks about doubting Thomas touching his side, and he refers to some of the details. He starts helping himself to those details, but at that point, he's not constraining himself to the minimal facts. That's not the minimal facts argument. Okay, and so he's going to have to justify that those accounts are actually rooted in eyewitness testimony and go back to what the original eyewitnesses claimed. And if he wants to do that, that's fine, but that's not what the 90% plus scholars will acknowledge. The majority of scholars think the appearances are probably pretty crappy, to be honest. Bart Ehrman, I think, says something like, well, maybe the group appearances were something like at a distance, and something like that. Gerd Ludemann, who apologists and even people like, I think I've heard Dr. Craig quote, as him acknowledging the appearances. Well, he thinks that the appearances were like seeing in the spirit. Well, what does that even mean? Like it's vague, right? And so we need to use the data that is actually relevant here. I think we're too excited that people acknowledge appearances, but again, they don't acknowledge that the appearances are anything like what they are in the Gospels, and so big whoop-de-doo, like there's no. Well, I think Dale Allison talks about the appearance to the 500. He's like, well, I don't know. How did they know they saw 500 people saw him? Was there a receiving line? Did he go around and shake everybody's hand and different things like that? I can provide you the quotes in his book if you want. There's no details about it. And so, yeah, this is why I think we have to go much further. But I don't think that it has to be difficult. Excuse me. I think it's a privilege to defend the reliability of the Gospels because there's an avalanche of good evidence that the Gospel authors were doing their best to report the facts and that they were close up to the facts and they were honest.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So specifically on just like evangelizing in general, like very basic here, what would you say is your goal? Like when you, I guess when you're just starting to evangelize, whatever, what is your goal? Like, so for example, my goal is just a very simple one. It is, to help the person understand more about Christianity, or raise the probability in their mind that Christianity is true. Very, very simple goal. Do you have a specific goal that you go into when you have these conversations?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think that's a good goal. I would agree that I want to raise the probability that Christianity is true. It's going to be relative to the person that I'm talking to. And so, are they an atheist? Are they a Buddhist? Are they a lapsed Catholic, or just cultural Christian? What are they? Who are they? And so, it's going to just take conversation, getting to know their background. My goal is to make sure that they understand the gospel message. Is the very first goal that I would have, because as much as in my own conversion, I think evidence played a role, and I'm a hardcore evidentialist, and so, but I think somebody can be justified. Justification by faith and justification in beliefs are not exactly always the same. Somebody could receive the gospel just because they you seem like a trustworthy person. That's not a good reason. Discipleship is like, okay, part of discipleship is, okay, now here's this evidence, right? Let's talk to you about the evidence. Let's get you a Bible. Let's get you in church, and then let's also build some evidence in you. But my goal is just to make sure that they understand the gospel first and foremost. And then if I need to use evidence, like I said, I'm more than happy to, if they have that pushback. It just really depends on how that conversation goes. If I'll even need to get into that. Discipleship? Absolutely. Now let's talk about some evidences here. Now let's give you some, maybe Peter J. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospel? Is a really easy book that any layperson, I think, could understand, so that you have some of those tools under your belt and can build some of your trust, and you're not a sitting duck in case you're scrolling YouTube and you come across like Apologia or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like when you're just talking about the minimal facts here, do you think that you know you've kind of talked about you don't find the minimal facts very convincing, but when you're talking to someone that's never even heard of the minimal facts or apologetics in general, and your typical skeptic off the street, if you give the minimal facts, you say, all these scholars believe this about the resurrection. They think that the disciples actually thought they had some type of experience that led them to following Jesus. I mean, do you think that's surprising to them? Do you think they care at all? What are your general thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, maybe that would provide to them a little bit of evidence, but again, that's very weak evidence. I don't think most people are aware of what biblical scholars do. I think a lot of people would be under the impression that they're Christians. You could say a lot of these people are skeptical, and that might raise some sort of credence to them. But I think again, what the if they're thinking a little bit, they should be going, what do those scholars think those appearances were like? Because there's miracle stories and unsolved mysteries and ancient aliens and all kinds of, okay, ancient aliens was a stupid example, but you know what I mean? Like, I've heard all kinds of fantastic stories, right? So why should I believe your fantastic story? And then if they press you and say, what were the appearances like? And you could say, well, a lot of scholars think those experiences were actually pretty crappy. And they think that, you have I wish I could remember her name. Biblical scholar. I'm drawing a blank on her name. Paula Friedrichsen.
Okay.
Paula Friedrichsen. She'll say, "Well, I know that they saw something, but what it is, I don't know." Okay. Well, she obviously thinks that the gospel accounts aren't very reliable, because she'd be like, "Well, the experiences were like the kind of experiences that I'm talking about." And if a lot of scholars are camping at kind of where she's at, why would the skeptic be very impressed with that? If it's not, if they look at it and they're supposed to be these cold historians and they walk away knowing these things and they're unconvinced, a minimal facts proponent, it seems to me, would be forced to say that they're doing it because of their stubbornness and they don't want to accept the evidence. Well, I don't think that's very fair. I don't think that's true. I think they think the gospel accounts are not reliable, and so therefore the experiences were pretty crappy. Where I'm willing to say, no, you guys are wrong. There's plenty of really good reasons that you are overlooking to think that the gospel accounts are reliable, and a lot of your reasons for saying that the gospel accounts are unreliable are notoriously bad. Biblical scholarship has notoriously bad habits. I mean, just study on, like, say, the authorship of the pastoral epistles. You'll be a lot less inclined to give these people a high amount of credence. A minimal fact, if we want to use the minimal facts as a rule, then technically, like, John is not a historically reliable book, that it's completely made up, that it's just some guy putting a bunch of words in Jesus's mouth, and that it wasn't written by John. I mean, that's a minimal fact. You got a heterogeneous amount of people, right and left, that will say that's true. And scholarship changes in various directions and ebbs and flows. And so yeah, I don't want to win somebody over even with bad evidence of, oh, they saw something but we don't really know what it is, or they don't know for sure, they just know the disciples really believed it, and then say, but now I'm going to argue that the gospels are much 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 more reliable than that. You should, after you've given your life to Jesus. I've worked in sales, but I've also worked as a manager of sales, and something important, more important than sales, is retention. And I work with Jonathan McClatchy's Talk About Doubts um, ministry. We do counseling, Zoom calls. Anybody, if you're watching this and you're experiencing doubts, like, definitely take advantage. Hope you don't mind the plug there. But it's a
Yeah,
good
totally.
ministry.
Everyone should go
Yeah.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we talk to people, and a lot of times they're very familiar with the minimal facts. I just talked to somebody recently who watched the debate, debate, conversation, whatever you want to call it, with Dr. Lacona and Dr. Allison, and was very troubled that Dr. Lacona could not very sufficiently answer a lot of Dr. Allison's kind of wishy-washiness and agnosticism. And Dr. Allison says that the skeptic is fully justified in being skeptical of the resurrection, just as much as he's skeptical of Marian apparitions, even though he doesn't know how to explain them because he doesn't know what to make of them. And so, what I'm saying is I'm dealing with people on constantly through Talk About Doubts about issues of historicity, who are on the verge of losing their faith, who are very familiar with the minimal facts, who could spit them out just as good as I can or better, um, and are aware of that particular argument, that are troubled and that have doubts. And so my goal is long term. I'm not just looking to close a deal. I'm trying to say that there's enough evidence here that even if you think that the prior probability of a miracle like the resurrection is low, that we have ample evidence to overcome and swamp that low prior, um, by arguing for the reliability of the Gospels, and that they're rooted in eyewitness testimony. And why would the disciples make such a claim in the face of a hostile audience?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I totally get that. Yeah, well, first of all, everyone should go to Talk About Doubts. Really great thing that they're doing there. Link will be in the description. So you mentioned something about we're not just trying to close the deal. I mean, just so we're on the same page. I don't want my audience to misrepresent you. I don't want to do it either. So do you perceive that as what is the minimal facts is doing?
No. And I don't want that to be like come across very ad hominem. Again, I think these people have good motives, and I think that they're persuaded by their arguments. I don't think that they've really sat and thought about this as much as maybe they have or should. Um, I don't think, to my knowledge, and I think I even saw it in some Facebook comments at least a few months ago, that Dr. Lacona acknowledged that he had not read Lydia's criticisms as of yet. And so I don't even know how aware of them that he is. I think Blake is familiar with them, and there are others who are familiar with them. Um, I know that maybe they've tried to rebut Lydia. But I haven't seen anything like publicly yet that has rebutted her points. And so again, it's like an epistemological thing of, again, I could say it till I'm blue in the face. Without knowing what the appearances were like, it's very difficult to justify the rationality of the disciples' belief. And a lot of common things that I see just in response is like, well, no, they believed it because, Paul talks about, we believe that the resurrection is physical. He's obviously in 1 Corinthians 15 very clear that he believes in the resurrection is physical. And, Paul preached the same gospel that the apostles preached. They gave him the right hand of fellowship. And they said, yes, Paul, you're doing a great job. You're preaching what we preach. And they'll add in all kinds of other facts to say, no, they definitely believed in bodily resurrection. But the upper limit of what you can argue with all of that is just that they believed it. We're just assuming that they were rational to believe this, and so we have to do better, right? If I was talking to my neighbor and maybe they were moving away and they're like, yeah, I'm moving away because I think this house is haunted, and I barely even talked to them, but they said, yeah, I had this experience of a ghost, and they came and talked to me or something like that. Maybe it was a family member, a ghost that came and talked to them. I'd be like, well, that's kind of weird. And then I never got the details of like their experience and what it was like. I might think, hey, I didn't think realize, my neighbor seems like a normal level-headed person, and maybe they did experience something, maybe they didn't. But unless they sat down and talked to me, like, what was this experience like? Who else was there? Did the ghost tell you something that pertained to like actual real life? Like what? Like again, like that's not enough to really move the needle to get me to believe them. They could even tell me like they were super religious. Maybe they're I don't know, a Jehovah's Witness, and Jehovah's Witnesses definitely do not believe in ghosts. They don't even believe that human beings are spirit. They just they're physicalists basically. That might move the needle a little bit, but that just still tells me that they believed it. I need to know details in order to know that they were rational. I can't just assume that somebody's rational just because they make a claim. It just any miracle claim or any kind of claim that is an extraordinary claim. We need. I'm not trying to use the atheist meme. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but they do require more evidence than just another claim, and so details matter. And
Mm-hmm.
might be beating a dead horse at this point, but I just want to make sure that that gets punched home.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like your biggest complaint is one that it's portrayed as, the one thing that you need as a Christian to prove God Christianity or whatever. You don't think that it gets you there, and you don't think it should be used. I get, obviously in comparison to other things, but so you did say that like maybe it gets you as far as the disciples actually believing what they were
Yeah.
doing. And so what if I told you that every single time that I ever talk to a skeptic, I can get them to say that they will at least acknowledge that the disciples actually believed in what they were doing, that they actually believed they had an experience. Like, would that not be helpful in this conversation, specifically when you're doing like the trilemma that you talked about, where one of those options is lying, correct?
Well, I think you could get skeptics to acknowledge that people really thought they saw Joseph Smith's golden plates. So what? That doesn't mean that we know what was on the golden plates. And they some of them said that they thought it was like a seeing in the spirit or something else. Like
So
I think we're
isn't
getting
that,
too I think we're getting too excited about a very unexciting fact.
but doesn't that raise the
Some people
probability?
saw, yeah, but not much. It's not enough to underwrite belief. Into, we're asking people to completely reorientate their lives around
Well,
the
right.
person of Jesus Christ.
So I just want to make sure,
So
like from my position, I, you know, well, I would consider myself a maximal data kind of guy, specifically because I'm more than happy to go wherever. Blake's talked about he's happy to go wherever in the Bible that
sure,
is the best way to prove that Christianity is true. So when we're talking about like what's the best approach here, and you're talking about giving evidence, if you're going to if you're able to rule out that the disciples were lying, I mean, you might say that doesn't, raise the probability a lot, but that's going
well,
to, remove a lot of doubts in the atheist mind, at least, right? Because that's what the most people think, anyways.
I think that they most of them don't think that they're lying. I actually, in most of my experience, the most popular thing to say now is that no, like they were mistaken. They misinterpreted. They overinterpreted something. They people will say that it's always more likely that somebody was mistaken than an actual miracle happened. And so if you're a skeptic, you're going to basically say that those details that we find in the gospels were just things that were added later, that they're embellishments. They're going to hang on to the mistaken option and say that they didn't really experience those things. They didn't claim to experience those things. And so that the disciples wouldn't have been rational to believe that he was risen. I don't think too many people have a problem with that they were lying. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't come up on the internet or something like that with just like your average person that it couldn't come up. But the pushback that I've gotten in my experience has been much more like, well, maybe they were just honestly mistaken. Well, how are we going to rule that option out if all we have is they believed that they had experiences with no details of what the appearances were like? What was the appearance to the 12 like? What did Peter experience? What did Paul experience? Paul doesn't even hardly mention it. He's writing occasional letters to churches, so he doesn't even go into the details of it. We're also going to have a more difficult time establishing their sincerity, because a lot of times a skeptic, if they're canny enough, they'll say, well, how do I know that they were willing to suffer to sincerely say this? Well, you're going to have to go to the details of Acts to get the 12 when they get arrested and called on the carpet by the Sanhedrin. You're going to have to go to the details in Acts to talk about Peter and James and John. You're going to have to go to the details in Acts to talk about James being martyred. Maybe the majority of scholars acknowledge that one. I don't know. Maybe they do. You're going to have to bring in these other details, mostly from Acts, about the willingness of their suffering. You could get Paul. You could definitely verify Paul was sincere, because I think everybody, honest biblical scholar, is going to say Paul was sincere. And he was totally willing to endure sufferings. It's pretty clear from just reading 2 Corinthians 11. But you're not going to get the details. You might get a little. You're going to have to argue. You're going to. People are saying that I'm going to have to like take a bunch of time and argue. You're going to really have to take a bunch of time and argue that Peter was martyred and James were definitely martyred. Now you're going to have to start helping yourself to the details in the accounts, and you're going to have to argue. The way that a lot of people I see argue is they'll kind of take like how Craig kind of does it, where he takes like a passage by passage approach. We'll look at the criterion of embarrassment, and we'll look at all these different biblical criteria, multiple attestation and double similarity or whatever, dissimilarity. I'm probably getting it wrong. And we'll just have to kind of argue from these things passage by passage and just kind of be agnostic, when we're putting our historian hat on about these other passages. Well, if I'm saying that the gospel writers are highly reliable, then I don't have to take that piece by piece by piece approach. Does that kind of make sense a little bit?
Yeah. I'm agree with most of that, honestly. So what if, just for sake of discussion, what if we granted literally everything you just said, and we take your maximal approach, which is everything, and of course everything includes the minimal facts. What if we just stuck with one minimal fact, which is that almost all scholars agree that the disciples had an experience, and then you could start with that. Someone asks, well, why do you believe in Christianity? Why do you think Jesus rose from the dead? Well, first of all, the disciples, most of them, most scholars think they all had an experience of some type of thing that made them, risk losing their lives. And then you could give your explanation by justifying the Gospels. You can use that scholarly consensus as a way to say, wait, almost like make the people you're talking to think like, oh, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that many people thought the disciples were genuine. And then, it takes literally 2 seconds. Like, what reservations do you have about that?
Well, to me, I mean, now we're going to have to argue. We're going to have to just back up and argue against scholarly consensus in a minute. So why am I vaunting them up only to have to kind of push back on it again? And so to me, it's just like the happenstance of scholarly politics just doesn't constrain the force of objective evidence. And the fact that something isn't granted by skeptical or liberal scholars doesn't mean that it's weakly supported. I think we have this like fear that people are going to just say, well, I'm just making this argument because I'm a Christian. They think that I'm going to say that the Bible is inerrant. Well, I'm not going to make that argument anyways. I'm going to give various reasons and examples of why the Gospels are highly reliable documents that are just based on objective evidence that anybody who's thinking clearly, I think, should be able to acknowledge and go, oh, that's interesting. That does show that they were close up to the facts. That does show that they were scrupulous. That does show that they were honest and reliable. I'd rather just assert that up front than have to bring in these this group of people in a discipline that's notoriously like sloppy, in my opinion, in a lot of different ways. And also consensus can always change, and and just bring them in. I'd rather just absurd it right up front and then just be prepared to argue for the reliability of the documents. I don't think this sociological fact of like a bunch of people agree on this is really nearly as impressive to skeptics as Christians think. You want to try it out, people can do it, but I don't think it's that impressive, because at best you're just giving them weak evidence. Well, so what? Like let's get to the meat and the potatoes here. I don't see why we got to do this dance. Like, let's just get to brass tacks.
Yeah, I think you kind of hinted at this. I think the difference between what most people that use the minimal faxes and well, maybe not most, but me and like kind of what I see is I'm kind of under the impression that if I walk to some person at my work or whatever that barely knows anything about religion, they think that I'm expecting at least that they're going to be like, we probably have some evidence for Jesus. That's probably about it. Nothing supernatural. They probably were lying, or they they were wrong. Blake talked about how he he's under the impression, at least, that most people aren't wanting to admit that they were wrong, or they would much rather say that they're lying. So it seems like what you're saying the opposite. So it seems like we just have a different impression of how people respond to the minimal facts. Does that seem right?
I just think that ultimately what really matters is like what's true, and are we giving people a vague report, or are we giving them a detailed report? And what I'm thinking is more of the epistemology, and like, okay, sorry if there's kids in the background playing. My sister-in-law's electricity went out, and so they had to drop them off here while they're fixing stuff. So I apologize. But anyway, I'm thinking like if I'm asking somebody to give their life, then it better be on good evidence. It better be on solid evidence, and I don't feel burdened or baggaged by. Well, I don't have a bunch of scholars who agree with me. So what? Why have we gotten so? I feel like we've gotten atrophied and weak in this area of defending the reliability of the Gospels, where we once were. I think Dr. William Lane Craig even says in his book Reasonable Faith that people shouldn't be saddled with defending something like the high reliability of the Gospels. I could be getting the quote a little bit wrong. I don't want to mangle him. I have a ton of respect for Dr. Craig. I'm a Reasonable Faith chapter director, for crying out loud. But he does use the word saddled when it is in direct reference to defending the reliability of the Gospels. I don't feel saddled. I feel privileged because there's a ton of really good evidence. I could sit there and pull out my Bible and show them like 5 different undesigned coincidences and say, hey, look, this is why this, over a lunch break, and say, this is why this looks like this is rooted in eyewitness testimony. I think that's powerful. I think that's more powerful than saying 90% of scholars agree that Jesus was crucified and people thought that they saw something. So I mean, I just don't get it. I don't understand some of the pushback that revolves around expediency, when expediency isn't the most important thing here. It's truth, and we have a lot of truth to back up our claims, and we just need to get bold and get tough and defend the Gospels, because it's a lot of fun and it's easy. And as I learned about these arguments as somebody who was into minimal facts and would get beat up by skeptics on Facebook groups and different things like that, who are completely unimpressed with anything that I had to say. And I'm not saying that they're always impressed with my undesigned coincidences either, but that's people online, but you're always going to have that kind of pushback. But at least I feel like I have a more, for me at least, one that I think a case that is more compelling, a more robust case that does give people details. And I think that is more intellectually honest. I'm not saying, again, I think minimal facts people have the right heart. I don't think that they're doing anything wrong. I think that they're doing their best, that they're trying to get people to think and push them towards Christ. I think all of that's great. All of that's a good motive. But if there's a big problem with the argument to begin with, it doesn't matter how effective we might think that it is. We need to stop using it. If it's fatally flawed, I don't care if we like it. I don't care if it's easy. I don't care if it's like doesn't require us to learn a bunch of other stuff about biblical reliability. Like if it has this flaw, then I don't see what other choice that we have.
Yeah, I'm all with truth, and if there's a big flaw, yeah, I definitely want to know. So this is why this has been helpful as far as getting the word out, helping people understand the facts. This has been really great. So on those topics of sharing the maximal data and all that kind of stuff, with I don't know how long you want to go, but go ahead and with whatever time you want to take, go ahead and just lay your argument for what is the best evidence for Christianity.
Yeah, there's an avalanche of evidence, and so I can just maybe provide like a little bit of a sampler. And so, like I said, if I was on my lunch break with a coworker or something like that, and I was able to talk to them, and maybe they were like, "Well, how the Bible's just a bunch of fairy tales." Well, one of the things that I would probably like to go with them through is like something like undesigned coincidences. And so now, for those people who don't know, an undesigned coincidence is basically where you have like two different accounts and they don't seem to be intentionally planned this particular way, but one piece leaves open a question that another writing along later comes and answers. But it does so in a very casual and undesigned way. It's not something that's done deliberately. So one particular example that I like is there is in Matthew chapter 14, and I don't have the scriptures in front of me here, so I'm just kind of doing this from memory. But basically, you have King Herod being like, "What's the deal with this guy Jesus? What is going on? Why does he have these powers working through him?" And he's saying this to his servants. Matthew's particular gospel is the only one that mentions Herod's servants that he's saying this to. Okay, well, that just raises a natural question. Like, how in the world does Matthew, of all people, know that what Herod is saying to his servants? Well, if we flip over to Luke chapter 8, it talks about some of Jesus's female followers, and it goes into some of their names. And it turns out that one of them's name is Joanna, the wife of Chuza, and Chuza was Herod's household manager. Okay, well, that answers that particular question, but again, it just does so in like this really undesigned kind of way. Well, I think that's much better explained on the hypothesis that these people were in the know, and this is rooted in reliable eyewitness testimony, than it is that they were just making this up and these pieces happen to fit. Now, that's just one example. Of course, like that just could be statistical noise, and we don't want to like make a hasty conclusion based on like a low low sample size, right? But there are dozens and dozens of these undesigned coincidences that I think any believer, if they really wanted to, could just mark up in their Bible and show people and just show that there's a case. Like one could be an accident, but a bunch of them, no, that doesn't seem very possible. Another example that I like, and this is for the feeding of the 5,000, in Mark 6:31 and 39, it says something to the effect of, "And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while.' And many were coming and going, and they had no leisure to eat. Then he commanded them to sit down in groups on the green grass." Well, that's interesting. There was many people coming and going, and there was green grass. Well, if we actually turn over to John chapter 6 and verse 4, it says that the Passover was at hand and the feast of the Jews was at hand. Now, the weeks just before Passover is the growing season in Palestine. And if you know anything about Palestinian topography, the grass is brown normally, like the majority of the year. But that's the season when it's growing, is at Passover time. And then we also know just from like history that like Passover, people are flocking from all over the diaspora to come celebrate the Passover at the temple. And so that's why there is a bunch of people there, which is also very interesting. But there's even more with this particular undesigned coincidence. In John chapter 6 and verse 5, in this story of the feeding of the 5,000, it talks about Jesus having a crowd around him. And he turns to a disciple and he says, "Where are we to buy bread that these people may eat?" Now, the particular disciple, if you were to make up a gospel story and you were just fabricating something, what disciple would you pick? Maybe Peter, because he's the group leader, he's really loud. Or maybe Jesus is asking Judas because Judas had the money bag, and Judas is the one in charge of buying things. But no, it says to him that it was Philip. Okay, well, why Philip? Philip doesn't really play a very big role in the Gospels at all. He's mentioned like a couple times in John, and he's named, in the 12 and the other accounts. But if we put the pieces of the puzzle together, it says that in Luke chapter 9, verse 10 through 11, it says, "On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart from a town called Bethsaida. And when the crowds learned it, they followed him." Well, if you actually turn over to John 12:21 in a completely unrelated passage, it says that Philip was actually from Bethsaida. So if you are looking to feed a hungry crowd some bread, you're probably going to turn and ask the local guy, where's the local Wally World here, And so he's asking the local person. So that makes sense. Again, this is better explained on the hypothesis that the Gospels were written on eyewitness testimony. And then they were just making these things up because they're not drawing attention to this. It doesn't look like it's deliberate. And fabricated pieces of two different pieces of fiction rarely interlock in this kind of way. And again, this isn't really difficult evidence for anybody to learn. Anybody with a Bible and just a little common sense and ability to look at evidence can see these things. There's one more thing that I'll add with this too. This particular undesigned coincidence, there's even more interlockings that we can bring in from Matthew. Matthew 11:21, Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Well, what mighty works? Nothing in Matthew up to that point has given us any clue. But as I just said, the feeding of the 5,000 happens in Bethsaida. And so that's why Jesus is being so harsh, is because they had a mighty work, or an amazing mighty work, and yet they didn't repent. And so, again, these things just look more like historical reality than fiction. Fictions and forgeries don't interlock this way. You don't get Moby Dick and it interlocks with Treasure Island. You know what I mean? And so these are just a few examples. And then at that point, you could just say like, "Hey, I got a book. You could borrow it, or I can recommend a book to you." Lydia McGrew's book on Undesigned Coincidences is a great book. Hidden in Plain View is the title. You could read J.J. Blunt's older version. Her version is more updated. Just called Undesigned Coincidences, and they could get it at the Google Play Store for free if they really, really want to dig further. And so those are just a few examples of like internal evidence. I mean, I could go into more and more. There's external evidences where the Gospels don't just interlock in a subtle and casual way with each other, but they also interlock with like actual history. One particular example that I find rather interesting is in Acts 27. Now, this is in the book of Acts, where there is a shipwreck, and they're on the Isle of Cauda, is where the shipwreck ends up happening. This is in Acts chapter 27. And Ptolemy and another geographer, historian kind of person from that era, I'm forgetting who it was exactly, get the location of the island completely wrong, like by a good distance. But only the author of Acts actually gets the actual like correct location of the particular island. And it was a 13-day journey because they were just being blown by the wind. And when you actually look back at the meteorological kind of like knowledge that we have, 13 days is the exact amount. 14 days is the expected time. No, it's 13 days. They get there in 14 days, whatever. Close enough. You get the idea of how much they would have been blown by the wind if the wind was at the expected speed. And so it's just kind of like, wow, well, that's really weird. Like, how does he get that detail right? And there's lots of things. There's a book by a guy named Colin Hemmer who has 84 different little small details that the author of Acts gets right that are best explained by him being an eyewitness and a traveling companion of Paul. And what's interesting about that is if Luke was the traveling companion of Paul and he wrote the book of Acts, well, that should increase our confidence in the book of Luke for one thing. And two, Acts 21 talks about that he was in Jerusalem when Paul was under arrest, which would have given him plenty of time to talk to witnesses, which is basically kind of what he says in his prologue. And so it puts him in a place where he would be in a position to know. And he's also traveling Paul where he's suffering and undergoing shipwrecks, apparently. So he's reporting something that he's sincere about and is in a position to know, and he's around people that are in a position to know some things. And so, yeah, those are just a little taste of the avalanche of evidence. Those are just a few examples. There are just dozens and dozens, and you could just go, if you wanted to go for 30 minutes or an hour, I'm not talking right now on the stream, or 7 hours. if like Mike Licona can debate Bart Ehrman for 7 hours about minimal facts, then by golly, I don't want to hear it takes too long, because we could go on with this in a small set of data, or we could go into all kinds of details. Any good argument can go into all kinds of details, and you can really get in the weeds. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was awesome. So how many of those minimal facts would you say there are?
Oh, these aren't minimal facts.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. So
what is the word?
Sorry. Undesigned coincidences?
Yeah, right. Sorry.
I think Lydia in her book gives, I want to say 30 that she believes are like the stronger ones. I know Blunt gives a lot more than that. Some are might be weaker to other people. Some might feel stronger to others. I just gave some of the ones that I think are good. And so there are definitely dozens of them. As far as like the external confirmations between like Acts, like there's also undesigned coincidences between Acts and the epistles of Paul. She's got like 20 more in there, I believe. There's a book by William Paley called Horai Paulini, which he just goes into like dozens and dozens of them that people can get for free. There's also the external confirmations. Paley, I think, lists 41 examples in his book, A View of the Evidences for Christianity, where the Gospels and Acts dovetail with what we know about actual history of the time, like through Josephus and other historians and different things. A lot of Josephus. And then I told you there was 84 in the book by Colin Hemmer. You might see it in my background a little bit there, the blue one on the second shelf. He goes through 84 different details, which again are best explained. Tiny details like little geographical details, details about the politics of the particular time, what people were called, their titles, even down to slang that was just local in particular areas. And so there's 84 of those. And so yeah, there's tons of that. And I think this is really important, because what skeptics will try and say, and this is a worry of, I think, people who are into the minimal facts, is like, well, if I do this, what about contradictions? What am I going to do when somebody says, well, yeah, there's all these contradictions? Okay, well, stop, slow down. I'm giving a positive case here. Let me give you some positive details. And then if you want to talk about contradictions, we can do that. But the thing about the contradictions is Bart Ehrman will say, well, yeah, here's like 50 or 60 contradictions. And then you actually go through his book in Jesus Interrupted, and a lot of them are based on ridiculous readings, partial readings, arguments from silence, just all kinds of shenanigans that Bart likes to play. And you find out that and I have a friend who's got a heavily annotated copy of that book. There's like 5 or 6 actual good contradictions that he has in there. But even if we were to acknowledge that after going through all of those different contradictions, and a lot of them are bad, well, that should increase your confidence a little bit. But then if there's 5 or 6, but I have all this other data, well, those 5 or 6 aren't going to overturn all the positive evidence. And we don't have to stop and let people dictate to us, like, when we talk about contradictions. We can just give our positive case. And then, if they want to talk contradictions afterwards, We can definitely do that, but there's only really a handful, and they're not going to do what the skeptic says they're going to do.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you were talking about New Testament now because, a big topic on my channel at least has been, documentary hypothesis and whether the sources of, the Torah contradict. And, something that, I've talked about a few times is, people in that time period weren't, contradictions weren't as big of a deal to them. So you could still have a trustworthy document that might have a few issues in it that don't necessarily historically, match up. But, if we're talking about something like the resurrection, like I don't see any reason why we would think that, why would they miss those details essentially? Or why would one small contradiction over here mean that, you've got to destroy the evidence for an entire message? Do you have any issues with that? I just want to get your thoughts there.
No. I mean, in eyewitness testimony, that's a feature of eyewitness testimony, is that there will be some contradictory evidence. And I find with a lot of times, even with skeptics, I even heard like Paul Gia the other day, it's not the contradictions that concern him about the evidence, which I thought was interesting. Not every skeptic is willing to say that. He's like, it's all the copying. It's the word for word copying that they do with one another that shows that there's no independence. Well, if the argument from undesigned coincidences goes through, sure, we'll acknowledge that Mark probably came first and Luke and Matthew used it as a source. Big whoop-de-doo. But if undesigned coincidences does its job, then it shows that there's partial dependence. There's also a lot of partial independence. And that again is best explained by eyewitness testimony. And then I think a lot of these contradictions are very easily reconciled through data that we have in the other accounts. One particular example would be like Mary at the tomb and the women at the tomb, right? And so there's like this whole, how many women was it? It depends on which gospel you read. Bart Ehrman is, very fond of saying that are really like easily reconciled in a way that I think is better explained in eyewitness testimony than another. And so it talks about in Mark chapter 16, it talks about Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome were there. And then Matthew says that it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And then Luke talks about Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them. But in John's account, it just says that on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came. So is John suggesting that it was only Mary that came? Well, if we actually read a little further, in John 20, verse 2, it says that she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Mary's choice of word here reveals in passing, just very casually, very subtly, that there were actually other women there. And John's report of these words shows that he actually knows this. And so when Ehrman and others bring this out, this appearance of contradiction only arises if we assume unjustly that each account is intended to be complete and to give us a comprehensive list of the women. But Luke explicitly says that there were others besides him, those that he names. He talks about and other women. And John tacitly shows that he knows that there were others besides Mary. And so far from actually contradicting each other, these actually dovetail in a way that, again, seems to me better explained on eyewitness testimony, because we know that when people are giving eyewitness testimony, they leave details out. They omit certain facts. And sometimes we don't even know why. We wouldn't even expect them to omit those particular facts, but we know that they do. So, yeah, and there's just lots of examples like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's awesome. I really like that example there. It seems like definitely people like Bart Ehrman, you hear these big numbers, all these contradictions, and it's like when you really dive down, as you said, maybe 6, and maybe the skeptic watching might think there's more, but I think there's no doubt that there are some things in there that some scholars will try to say it's just like, no, it's just not a good argument, and
right.
I think it's very telling. But anyways, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on here. Everyone should make sure to go check out Testify, his channel, and talk about doubts and McGrew's books. Doing those things can only help the faith. This has been awesome talking to you. Any last words, anything you want to say to people?
Yeah, sure. Again, my point isn't to bash a particular argument in a way that's like trying to draw attention to myself or to get clicks or to just be controversial and stir things up, because everybody knows that controversy gets attention. But this is a pastoral concern, from talking to a lot of people with doubts, who are well aware of these things, and just helping Christians to try and have the best evidence. And I think as Christians, we need to recapture taking the forward position rather than just to be on the defensive, and to just be about giving the best evidence that we could give. And if people at the end of the day disagree with me, that's completely fine. I think that we have the same goals, but let's talk about those disagreements, in a productive kind of way. And if anybody feels like I got anything wrong in this particular stream, then feel free to let me know. And if I want to be as accurate as possible. But again, there's this fatal flaw, I think, with the minimal facts for sure. And I hope people just got a little taste. And there's so much more with the books that you recommended from Lydia McGrew. Peter J. Williams has got a good one. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses is another good book. It's kind of mixed. It's like some of the stuff I disagree with, some I don't. But there is an abundance of resources. So just be encouraged. As apologists, let's quit skipping leg day, so to speak, because defending the Gospels is fun. It's awesome. There's so much good data. So yeah, I probably already said that, but I'll just beat that dead horse one more time and just get that out there. So
awesome. I appreciate the message, Erik. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Yeah, you too, man.